Welcome to the LocoFoco Netcast. The sound of the match is the sound of LocoFoco, for LocoFocoism began in the 1830s in New York City, and it began with the lighting of a new match, the LocoFoco match. People who had been deplatformed struck those matches, lit candles, and carried on the business of taking over Tammany Hall. It was quite a moment in American history, and it means something special to this program for, well, I named it LocoFoco Netcast, so that's pretty obvious, right? And because I'm interested in LocoFocos, the historical LocoFocos, as well as their ideas, which I've been interested in since I was a young man, is that I not infrequently like to consult the historian of LocoFocoism, Anthony Comegna, and that's who we have on today for the third time on this podcast. He has his own podcast with his employer, Institute for Humane Studies. That podcast is Ideas in Progress, but as I went into this podcast and interviewed Dr. Comegna, I forgot his title. I never remember it. I have a hard time remembering people's titles. The only reason I think of him as a doctor is because I like calling him Dr. LocoFoco, which is his Twitter handle. That is the reason to call him Dr. LocoFoco, is you can find him on Twitter as Dr. LocoFoco. So let's go into the conversation with Dr. Anthony Comegna, and let's find out, what does he do for a living, and what can he tell us that's relevant to today about the LocoFocos and libertarian ideas in American history.
Well, I am a humble academic programs manager, which means I'm in charge of a particular set of programs, and in my case, it is our internal discussion colloquia, so our discussion-based programs mainly for graduate students. That's my wheelhouse. And of course, I do the podcast, as you said.
Right, Ideas in Progress. Available on iTunes and everywhere else, I'm sure. I listened to it. I believe I listened to it on 2 different platforms, because apparently one platform isn't enough. So, one of the things you talked about in your most recent podcast was the origins of the LocoFoco movement in the writings of William Leggett. Now,
yes,
we've talked about that before on this program, so that should be all clear, except people forget about these things. You hear it once or it was in the backlog a year ago, they're going to forget about it. So we can go over a little bit of that again before we move on to something a bit more recent. And mainly, I'm very curious about your opinions of the ideological climate of our time. That's something I'm curious about, if that's something you're interested in talking about.
Yeah, sure. So I would trace the LocoFoco party's origins and the movement's origins really back to 1828 and the original Workingmen's Party, which came first out of Philadelphia, but it popped up in other, especially northeastern cities during that campaign year. And it was the first third-party movement in American history and politics. It came about, of course, before what we even call the second party system was really a thing. That was the year, after all, that Andrew Jackson finally won the presidency, after it was stolen away from him, if you believe that, or after John Quincy Adams just simply won it under the proper system. But and so it was the first third party movement before there were even really the 2 national parties that we are familiar with from that era, and it was decidedly sort of left wing. It was not as like libertarian as we understand the LocoFoco party to have been, but they really hammered away at the rhetoric and the importance of monopolies in our economy and the ability of well-connected, influential people to twist Republican politics toward their private purposes, especially in the granting of corporations by legislatures, especially in bank charters. And the Workingmen's Party essentially advocated the average working person's ability to combine their own powers, both politically, socially, and economically. So, they supported what the courts would call conspiracies, right, which were the early labor unions. The court said these were conspiracies against the business owning class to raise wages and things like that, and to better working conditions. And that was just something the law could not abide, these conspiracies. And of course, the idea was, well, that's social power at work. In order to advance the interests of certain people. That is the legitimate use of one's power. So workingmen's parties popped up in that campaign year of 1828 and started making these anti-monopoly arguments. And then that spread and got picked up by more later radical figures, people like William Leggett in New York City. And Leggett was decidedly free trade and in favor of limited government in absolutely every way he could get it. And so he took that sort of political momentum and the idea that there was a coalition to be made with otherwise Jacksonian Democrats and the old workingmen's folks. And that was the kind of coalition that intellectually he put together at the Evening Post. And he was not one for political movements. He really didn't care about making a third party. But all the people that followed his ideas that did want to break away came to be known as the LocoFocos. So that's basically how Leggett served as the origins of that movement. He took these workingmen's ideas and fused them with the free trade, small government, Jacksonian ideology into one coherent anti-monopoly ideological system. And to me, that is, in essence, modern libertarianism.
There's an interesting historical moment where Karl Marx is inspired by the workingmen's movement. Some say that's really quite key for Marx's development as a thinker. And but did you have any contact at all with Leggett?
I'm almost certain not. I mean, I think Leggett died almost a whole decade before Marx was in the U.S. So
Marx just wasn't able to make a connection that Leggett was able to make.
He would have been in America at the time. Gosh, when was Marx living in New York? Was it late 1840s or was it even later than that? I can't quite recall. But he certainly did not live in the U.S. at the time Leggett was alive. But he would have lived in the U.S. at the time when LocoFoco was still in such common usage that he would be familiar with it. It would have been a slur term for all Democrats at the time, which is a story that we've discussed. Meanwhile, the workingmen, the proper workingmen's people, were still out there as sort of a fringe element in these political circles, just like our more radical Leggettian types were kind of filtering back and forth between parties as the circumstances called for it. The more lefty workingmen did the exact same kind of thing. Often they were allied with the LocoFoco free trader types, but often not. So I'm quite sure Marx would have been at least familiar with the term LocoFoco. Though I don't know what he would have done with it, because as I think you mentioned before, I don't think he would have agreed with them on a whole lot.
In Das Kapital, I'm pretty sure it's Das Kapital, it could be Critique of Political Economy. I mean, he basically calls the economists that we like, at least that I like a lot, from Condillac and Destutt de Tracy, now completely forgotten, but, people like that, terms that we wouldn't normally see in a scholarly book. There are some pretty negative comments that he makes about people who think that trade is productive, which I think is the key error that Marx makes. Everybody focuses on the labor theory of value when they critique Marx, and that's understandable. However, I just look at it as he denies that value is gained in trade. And as soon as you deny that, almost anything is possible, because it's one of the most basic truths there is, right?
Well, I was thinking one of the areas where there's some overlap is in class theory, but Marx, I quite imagine, would have called these people, bourgeois or petty bourgeois, sort of traitors to their proper working class origins or something like that, because the LocoFocos had a distinctly class-based view of history and society and conflict, but it was the classical liberal theory of conflict that Marx borrowed and essentially built upon and then called it something different because he took it in the wrong direction. But he lifted their class theory and then just got rid of the political element.
It's kind of funny because he still retains a political element in his thought. I mean, that's really important, the idea that the state is there to help the bourgeois or bourgeoisie. Right. That's the point of
Yeah.
his one of his points. He doesn't seem to get the idea that the state can be captured by any group, except that he does. That's the other thing is that's one of the funny things about dealing with Marx. He's so slippery.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because I brought that up because actually think this is one of the reasons historians in especially the 20th century have forgotten about the Locofocos almost on purpose, precisely because when you look into it, so many of them are doctors or lawyers, or they own grocery stores and general trade stores and stuff like that, or they are sort of some of them are the founders of the earliest trades unions, and they're what we would call or professional organizers and stuff like that in the community today, and to historians of the 20th century who have so many of these Marxist class proclivities, or they're Cold War historians specifically trying to say there have never been class divisions in the United States, whichever side of the divide you are on there, you have an interest in ignoring the history of the Locofocos, these weird people who talked about class constantly and cared about it constantly, and yet sort of transcended those very economic class divisions that we're so used to. So it's not that class was absent from their movement or their society, and it's not that it was all about economics or wealth either. They had a clear idea of class that was about power, access to politics especially, but really all types of power. And academics essentially would rather ignore that for their own purposes, or they just disagree with it, and so they don't care to spend time on these people.
Well, it does provide an interesting contrast with Alexis de Tocqueville's stressing of how egalitarian American society was of this precise period. He saw it as democratic and equality. He saw equality. He called it equality of outcomes. I believe that's the term, if I remember right. I'm almost certain that's the term he uses, which he doesn't mean wealth. He just believes it's less class than he's used to in Europe, and that may be the case. But the Locofocos nevertheless showed that there was a class problem in America.
Yeah, and actually, a lot of them criticized Tocqueville's perceptions of the U.S. because they said, of course, you're going to come out with this rosy picture when you're wined and dined by a bunch of our homegrown aristocrats and elites, and the fact is that there's a lot more conflict here than he might think, and democracy, they thought, is the solution. Dissolve that power and privilege still as much as we can, and we probably won't have much of an aristocracy to speak of any kind for very long. It's only like the vestiges of feudalism that remain that let that happen in the first place. But they were very uncomfortable with a lot of Tocqueville's impressions because they criticized the way he traveled around the country.
So that's actually very interesting. And I think that people listening might actually get the idea now that this is not, the divides in America aren't exactly new. And if you think about what Andrew Jackson was like, he is sort of a Trumpian figure. So at that period of time, there was a figure that had an element of the bravado, the myth-making, I hate to use the word narcissism because everybody uses it, but there's an element of Andrew Jackson that was controversial then, and in Trump was controversial up until just a few days ago, and then now we don't know what's going to happen. But because when Andrew Jackson left, he didn't have a huge personal presence on politics, did he? He didn't last much longer after his presidency. Is that correct?
I think he died in 1844 or 45. He lived long enough to endorse James K. Polk.
Okay.
That's for sure. He did actually exercise a big personal presence in that leadership definitely felt the need to travel to the Hermitage or to write to Andrew Jackson and get his endorsement one way or another, official and public, or through private correspondence. They definitely did feel the need to curry his favor. It was absolutely the party of Andrew Jackson until he died, and then it was a scramble to figure out whose party it was.
Okay. Well, he wasn't impeached twice, so that's obviously a difference between Donald Trump.
No, but he was censured. He was censured for his war against the Seminoles in Florida, long before he became president.
American history certainly is a vibrant and wonderfully wacky domain, which keeps us amused, at the very least.
Yeah, he got censured mainly because John C. Calhoun, later his vice president, supported censuring him. And Calhoun always kept it a secret, and Jackson did not know until all the controversy in the nullification crisis boiled over, and Calhoun became his open enemy. Then he found out that Calhoun was responsible for the censure, and Jackson always hated that blot on his record and all of this, and suddenly, they're mortal enemies. I guess you can see a Trump-Pence thing there, maybe.
There's something odd going on there.
But I think people make way too much of the Andrew Jackson comparison. And I'll tell you, namely right now, it's because Jackson was a winner and Trump is, simply put, a loser. I mean, it's only been like one election Republicans have won the popular vote in 40, 50 years or whatever anyways. But Trump is just he's lost too much. He's too much of a loser. And I understand a lot of people who love him might hate hearing that, but man, nobody has to care what he says anymore. And gradually people will forget, and they'll forget and not care, and he'll lose more and more support from rank and file party members, and there won't be anything for him to grasp onto anymore. Andrew Jackson conquered American politics, and he was absolutely the kind of man that Trump wishes he were.
Right.
Trump wishes he could play the part of the man on the white horse who comes to save the day and is immortalized in statues. But he's not that sort of person. And Andrew Jackson, for better or for worse, I think for much worse because he was horrible, he was that kind of man. And, Trump wishes.
Yeah, well, Jackson had an easy target. Jackson had a small government compared to what we have now. Donald Trump was opposed by the deep state. That is a huge confluence of interests that are permanent in America. Much of it behind the scenes in the CIA, the FBI, and they attacked him fairly openly, which I think is really instructive. So my sympathy is with Trump more than it is with Andrew Jackson. Not because Trump is a good guy, not because Trump knows anything. He doesn't. That's pretty obvious that he was not merely ignorant of government in the world, but incurious. That's been a problem from the very beginning with Trump. But I think that Trump was surprised to find how big the swamp was. You could drain a swamp if you think it's just a small size. If you realize that it's the whole of the system, that's a bigger deal. And he was, of course, destroyed by it. So as a loser, he is the loser that Americans are. He's the loser we are. So my sympathies are much more with Trump than they are with Andrew Jackson, because Trump had a bigger job and he didn't realize how big it was. That's actually how I look at all of the right, is they keep on forgetting what they're up against, because they want everything to be easy to, it's constitutional. We can change things and go back to the Constitution. We're a long way from the Constitution of the United States.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, in some ways, I suppose the two presidents' failures as president are more similar than their successes or their personal comparisons that we might draw. People at the time, hell, there was a whole the second third party movement, and the first actual national convention was held by the anti-Masons, and the anti-Masonic party pointed out that Jackson, if you're talking about deep state, Jackson is deep state, right? He's a Mason, along with like virtually everybody else in the leadership of American society for the last 40, 50 years at that point. So, Jackson, people might have liked to think of him as somebody sent there to drain the swamp and all of that, but you're sending a master Mason or whatever to go drain the swamp of all these Masonic people, and probably not going to work out. Now but that said, somebody like Jackson went in and actually did fire a bunch of people and shrink the federal budget and deficit and pay off the debt for the first and only time ever and things like that. But while he was doing that, he appointed Samuel Swartwout to the collectorship of New York, the Port of New York, I think, and he like embezzled $8 million or something like that. It was the biggest crime in American history up to that point. And, so we're talking about the failures of democracy. I mean, you put it as, his failure is our failure and all of that. I think that's true in the sense that democracy, to quote Kent Brockman from The Simpsons, I've said it once and I'll say it again, democracy simply doesn't work. I think there's too much truth to that. Most Americans are uncomfortable considering that idea. But to me, the solution is, well, we need to stop this farce that governing each other is even possible, let alone preferable. But that's a whole other that's getting us afield.
Well, except that it is our field. I mean, this is where we debate and try to figure out, do we have any purchase on a political reality that is people who think like us, who think in a basically generally libertarian way? There's a lot of us in America. I mean, there's probably a good 10% of Americans think generally in our direction. But what do you do with that? It's hard to do anything with it in a society that isn't built around our ideas, right? So we try to have we try to find some purchase in the reality we live in, which isn't libertarian at all, or not much. And we each find different little leverage points. And then we argue about which one's better. And I'm at once sympathetic with everybody and also sympathetic with very few, because I don't think most of them work very well. Rhetorically, the Constitution is very effective because the Constitution has some really good things going for it. Not practically speaking, but just simply that it is a constrained vision of human nature. It doesn't deal with human beings as, masters of their fate. We are all fallible individuals in our various groups. And so let's decentralize power. That's an important thing, that if you don't buy the decentralized power idea, the idea of distributing power more widely through a more libertarian system isn't going to cross your mind very easily. And I have to confess, I often say that I moved to libertarianism with a series of deliberate steps as I developed libertarian ideas after reading Robert Nozick and a few other people. That was my real introduction point to libertarian ideas, was Robert Nozick. But I started out a decentralist. I understood the decentralist idea. I thought it was a great idea. I like Thomas Jefferson. So if you start out liking Thomas Jefferson, you're probably not very far from the libertarian idea already. But people today, there's people who the very idea of decentralized power seems strange to them.
Yeah, I think that's true. Lots of people, I think, though, have good reason to feel that way. And, I take that as just part of the intellectual work to be done. But, there are plenty of groups that I think justifiably feel like if they did not have the protection of a central power, they would be left to the cruel devices of their neighbors, and their histories have shown that that's not a good place to be in. I mean, this is where I think we can all understand the Native Americans' position in the wars between the British and the Americans, and other colonial powers, that they wanted whatever side would leave them alone the most. And, that's an unenviable position to be in no matter what. You can't really fault them for siding whichever way. But they felt like, who cares if Britain is a more centralized system? The fact is that they're all the way over there, and so they're going to leave us alone.
Right, and Britain did go anti-slavery earlier than America did.
Yeah, sure. Although, at the time of the Revolution, nobody would have known that. But I guess my point of comparison is that, for example, African Americans, I think, have perfectly good reason to feel like they need a powerful central government in the world they occupy, because without it, they would be left to the devices of states that just a few decades ago didn't even allow marriages like mine to exist, you know? And they have good reason to feel that way, because I'm not so sure that society has actually changed enough that without those kinds of constraints, we would be responsible enough. You know, something that Liberty Fund, for example, is always very clear about. Their founder wanted to make sure that the institution would always foster discussions about both liberty and responsibility, because they're both essential to be practiced together. And if all you want to do is, you know, live as freely as possible, and yet your conception of freedom means, you know, Mad Max style drag races across the ruins of civilization, then, you know, that's not very good. You have to be responsible with the liberty you want to exercise, and we shouldn't expect people to clamor around libertarian ideas if we're not willing to also then make a constant series of moral arguments that we need to behave better to each other. So I always try to keep those two things close together.
I've always looked at libertarian ideas as responsibilitarian, to use an uglier term and a longer one. So that's really an important move and a win there. But nevertheless, responsibility is a key concept. But it's amazing how rarely it's analyzed. And even in libertarian circles, is that responsibility, I don't actually know of any major treatises on responsibility as such. Responsibility isn't the same thing as obligation, and it's a robust concept. It's been dealt with in recent times by philosophers, mainly Joel Feinberg and Finn Garrett, but neither of those are libertarians, and Finn Garrett probably will now be remembered for his videos with The Atlantic about how awful it is to be dying. So if you're interested in a rather interesting discussion, well, maybe not that interesting, but it's kind of very human. And so we have an interesting time, and the idea of responsibility is being won back in the culture by Jordan Peterson. That is an interesting thing that he's done, is that he's made it interesting to talk about. And it's obvious, I think, that people want to embrace it again, or some people want to embrace it again. Jordan Peterson tends to lean in a rather strange way to conservative ideas. Is that, I mean, he said things that, like being for responsibility but against rights, which is a very strange thing to say for someone like me, because rights are the flip side of obligations, and it's all a responsibilitarian system. But it's popular among conservatives to say, oh, we can't talk about rights, we have to talk about responsibilities, which is a way of sneaking, politically, it's a way of sneaking a lot of weird conservative stuff into the mix. I don't think Jordan Peterson does that, but that's what conservatives often do. So libertarians, once again, are in a strange philosophical place compared to everybody else. I think we need to unite people, but I'm not sure uniting people has been something we're good at.
It's definitely not. I also don't necessarily, I don't know, I'm one of these like anti-activist libertarians, especially in looking at the history of the LocoFocos, which I take to be a tragedy, and we've talked about that before. By succeeding in certain ways, they ended up just burying and disappearing their movement, you know, becoming indistinguishable from the other parties that latched onto their ideas. And I'm more of the opinion that we should just not bother trying to direct change and just do your own little thing, whatever it might be.
Well, that's a nice thing for personally, because I don't want to get involved in politics either. I mean, other than, you know, by contract. I mean, if you want to pay me to help you with your campaign, I'd be fine with somebody doing that. But aside from that, I'm not going to get involved personally. I have people, regular people, normal people. I have lots of I actually have contacts in the real world with real people who say I should run for office. Now, I can't imagine a worse candidate than me. Literally, I don't even understand this, but people are actually searching for something. And so it's hard not to want to supply it every now and then, right?
It's hard not to. Yeah, I agree. But I also have this I don't know how you could test this or prove this or whatever. I'm not to brag, but I'm not a philosopher. Um, and but I have this hunch that the hardest and most important moral decisions are when you have to decide not to do anything, even though you really, 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 really want to. Um, you have to realize that, almost always doing something and intervening makes things worse. And so you have to really try as hard as you can to resist that urge to get involved and do something. And, we can come up with 1,000 different examples of this kind of moral quandary. You see it in movies a lot and whatever, but resisting that urge to get involved and do something is often like the most important thing you can do, and the most difficult thing for you to do. And I think that way about politics basically in general, and any kind of aim for a social movement. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't hope that through the cumulative impact of our different lives, things won't improve. I mean, that's what we are doing at places like IHS, or Liberty Fund has been doing forever, and FEE and other groups like that. They're not trying to direct social change in any sense. They're just trying to do good things out there that they think are important and meaningful, and hopefully things will improve. But people who really, really try hard to go out there and change things usually just make more enemies, and I kind of think we need to be happy with like whatever we might get out of resisting the urge to muddy ourselves in politics or social change discussions.
Yeah, I'm basically on your page, in your camp. If it is an encampment, because we're saying that we shouldn't encamp too much. But aside from that, I don't know. I go back and forth on all these things because I just don't know. These are one of the many areas of the things that are, what should we do? I'm not sure I know. I barely know what I should do tomorrow. So that's sort of the more humble look at the world that I have. But I do enjoy the ideas, and I think the history is important. And one way of looking at it might be like, as Robert Nozick talked about towards the end of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, is that one form of utopianism isn't where you build the society, it's where the society builds out of your better actions. I think he has actually one whole categorization of utopianism is this idea you're just talking about, is that if you just distribute good practices broadly in a framework for utopia, of course that's key, and that's where it's difficult. You can't do that under socialism, so we have issues. But that is the preferred method for people like you and me. I think that's true.
Yeah. And, even more so than libertarianism, I would say that progressive utopianism is the American ideology. It's the original ideology of our space in time and geography. Everything else kind of came from somewhere else at some other time, including libertarianism. But this idea of a true, new society and way of life created out of nothing by intention of the community members is not that it's only sprung up in America, but this was a unique period of it based purely on the American experience and democracy and republicanism and new ideas about community and all these homegrown things in America. And it's a shame that progressivism has been so bastardized, and it's a shame that utopianism is laughed off,
Yeah. Now, we're getting into a bit of history that got me interested in this in the first place when I was 15 years old. The utopian experimentation in America, which was a huge issue in the 19th century. And it became that. Are you suggesting then that utopian imagination became, in the culture generally, progressivism as we know it today?
Well, that's kind of the thing. I think it's a shame that we think of progressivism the way we do, because originally people used the word all the time just to mean progress, good change, not technocratic experts micromanaging everything, and putting in sterilization campaigns and crazy stuff like that. They just meant, the betterment of man, and that can be accomplished in all sorts of ways, from like being vegetarian and like in Fruitlands, one of the communities, or sharing your labor in all sorts of different ways in one of these Robert Owen phalanx communities and stuff like that. Or maybe you want to, new religions like Mormonism fit in this mold, which I always say is the quintessential American religion in the same way. Like it is uniquely American. It's uniquely a product of this space and these ideas. And I think the same thing for a lot of these radical intentional communities that you were talking about. And the shame is that the progressives, the capital P technocratic statist progressives at the time in the early 1800s were the planters. These were the people that the planters in the South were pioneering, medical technocratic government by having doctors, fake doctors like Samuel Cartwright, diagnose diseases like when a slave wants to run away. It's not that slavery is horrible, and of course a human being would want to run away from it. No. He has a medical condition called drapetomania, and that needs to be treated by a rigorous regime of physical discipline, and it will condition his body out of drapetomania, and other things like that. Phrenology and other pseudosciences fed into this, but that was the technocracy of the day. And of course, they pioneered police state methods too, all to keep the slaves in line and to keep them from rebelling. And those costs were put up with by Southerners, essentially because they enjoyed a different kinds of benefits under white supremacy. But it's a shame that history quirked and turned such that progressivism, got mixed up with these intentional utopian communities that were perfectly libertarian, just living out there on their own, trying to have fun. Even the weird like sex cult communities,
noise and things like
when
that.
they broke up, they usually broke up because they didn't want to do it anymore, and the men were like, well, that's fine, I'm not going to keep you here. Like it was still perfectly, might have been creepy and weird, but it was still apparently non-aggressive and perfectly peaceful, because that's just how they wanted to live.
There's a lot of strange concepts in American history, and they pop up here and there, and sometimes they just seem to be boiling under the surface. And if you look around, that's that old idea that I've encountered before, but now different people, or seemingly different people, are espousing it. George Fitzhugh is somebody you've talked about on your podcast, or on some podcasts that I followed. At a certain point, all the podcasts began to blur in my mind. But, on Ideas in Progress, I think you've talked about George Fitzhugh. He was quite a character, and he believed that he identified the slave system with socialism.
Gosh, I can't remember now which historian said it, but whoever wrote the intro for like the 1950s version, I don't think it was Kenneth Stamp, but it was around that era, 1950s, 60s version of Cannibals All, or Sociology for the South. In the introduction, the historian says, that throughout American history, essentially all of it has been dominated by the ideas of John Locke. Our political system, our intellectual landscape, everything we think about politics and citizenship and political theory, all of it goes to John Locke, with so few exceptions that the exceptions prove the rule. And George Fitzhugh is one of the extraordinarily few exceptions. He was somebody who overtly declared how much he despised John Locke, and he said over and over he preferred Sir Robert Filmer much more than John Locke. And I'm sure Filmer was the guy that Locke was directly responding to. Filmer was the royal absolutist, essentially a theocrat, arguing for the divine right of kings. And that's why John Locke wrote the first treatise, which most people don't bother reading, but the first treatise is just dismantling Robert Filmer's system. And somebody like Fitzhugh thought that was kind of the end of the world as we know it. and he wanted to roll back the clock to the feudal period. And you're right, he identified slavery with socialism. He said, look, you socialists are so upset about how awful the capitalist ruling class is, and we agree with you. It's despicable how these northern factory owners treat their workers. They let them freeze in the winter months. They throw them out of work because the mills aren't working, the water wheels aren't turning, and so you get out of here. I'm not paying you another dime. I don't care if you starve or freeze. I'll replace you with cheaper labor next season. And we take care of our slaves, whether we're making a profit or not. They're our family. And that's the right way to run a society. That's how the old feudal lords used to do it. They took care of their serfs. That was their job. The serfs would owe them loyalty, just like we expect loyalty from our slaves. But we owe them a living and comfort and respect. And it's, of course, an incredibly romanticized and really violent portrayal of slavery because it's so wrong, and he knew it. But it was also absolutely disgusting to most of his white audience, because Fitzhugh said that slavery is the ultimate form of socialism, and anybody in favor of socialism needs to admit that slavery is the fundamental basis of a good society. And free society just spirals out of control. You get all these crazy reform movements that aren't rooted in tradition or culture at all. They have no ties to anything. They don't care about anything, and they just go wild into free love and anarchism and drug use and all kinds of crazy things. And his book Cannibals All, he was arguing that, in a free society, people just eat each other. It's constant competition, like crabs in a barrel, and they'll just eat each other until there's one left. But in slave society, just like in a socialist society that you want to see, we take care of each other, and that's the proper way to run the world. Now, he took that to its logical conclusion, which was that plenty of poor whites should also be enslaved. And that's the thing that would make any good Southerner spit. They would not abide by that. And so, as this historian noted, maybe only 10% of Southerners even would have, claimed some kind of agreement with Fitzhugh. But for the most part, nobody wanted to hear this. They might take some of his arguments, but you go that far to saying, let's break the color line by making more people slaves? No way. Which just tells you they knew what they were trying to avoid. They knew how awful it was. They weren't going to put themselves there at the whim of these masters. Not a chance.
Yeah, that's quite a bracing book. One of the best titles of all time. Also, let's give Mr. Fitzhugh, or the Devil, his due. I mean, that is a great title.
I think he's a great writer, and I actually find him a really challenging thinker. Like if you take his ideas seriously, especially if you position him within that intellectual battle between the free society in the North, the free capitalist society in the North versus the socialists in Europe, and the working men's type people versus the planters in the South, this triangular intellectual contest, he's a really challenging thinker to have to deal with.
My colleague Pierre Lemieux wrote an introduction to an ebook reprint of one of those books. I think that it was Sociology for the South that he took on, not Cannibals All. That's a very interesting time. Now, out of the foment of intentional communities, utopians of the 19th century, grew one particular thinker, Josiah Warren, who is important, for our side, so to speak, because he realized that there was something wrong with the Owenite communities, that they did something strategic that was against human nature, and he developed the importance of individuality, which is something that was referenced by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, and I believe even cited Josiah Warren by name. Which is an astounding thing in its own little way, to see cross-pollination go from one side of an obscure figure. I mean, most people have never heard of Josiah Warren. Most everybody who's been involved in reading world history and philosophy and politics knows about John Stuart Mill. So here we have an interesting cross-pollination. And out of Josiah Warren grew a whole bunch of interesting people. Some of the people that I first got interested in politics and political theory was those people, Lysander Spooner and others. You've done some work on Lysander Spooner, or you've at least talked with people who have done a lot of work with Lysander Spooner. But my podcast, I don't believe, has ever mentioned Lysander Spooner. I can't remember a mention at any point. So maybe could you give a little bit of a Lysander Spooner introduction or preface to an interesting man?
Yeah, I think you did ask me before if he had any direct connection to the LocoFocos, because it just struck you like, oh my God, I never really considered that question before.
Okay.
And I'm not aware that he did, although he must have encountered the ideas, right?
Right.
But Lysander Spooner is just an amazing figure. I mean, if he's not like your favorite libertarian of all time, it damn well better be William Leggett or somebody like maybe a Benjamin Lay or somebody else like that, because Spooner is just incredible. And there's a lot you could say about him, although there's not much scholarship on him. It's just that what we do have is also fun. He first became famous or important. He was from a place called Ethel, Massachusetts, which is spelled Athol, Athol, but I believe it's pronounced Ethel.
That's very helpful for us who only read and don't have idea how we're pronouncing things. So it's Ethel. Okay.
Yeah, I at least think it's called Ethel. But he was studying to become a lawyer, and the law in Massachusetts at the time was that you could not practice law on your own without having a college degree. And Spooner had been a clerk for quite a while, and he was perfectly competent to pass the bar and practice on his own. And so he just started practicing on his own. And he was sanctioned by the state government or the bar association or whatever. I'm not entirely clear on the details, but he was sanctioned to say, you need to stop practicing. You don't have a college degree. And so he sued, saying that, this was a unconstitutional barrier to entry, essentially setting up a class division of the educated and the uneducated, those who are allowed to practice law and influence its trajectory through the courts, and those who are not. And he won. So the law was repealed the next year, and that was, so far as I know it, his first major victory in the legal sphere. And he practiced law for some time. The next big story of prominence that most people who know him will have been familiar with is his American Letter Mail Company. And this deserves a little bit of backstory, because this is one area where I'm not entirely clear on the details, but I have my suspicions. We talked before about William Leggett and the mails controversy, where in the first direct mails campaign in 1835, a New York anti-slavery society sent a bunch of pamphlets down to South Carolina to be distributed through the mail, just in the hopes that people would read it and come to an abolitionist conversion in the South. And a mob heard about this. They burst into the post office there in Charleston and seized the mail and burned it. And that was where, because the Postal Service, the Postmaster General, Amos Kendall, decided to ignore it. The Jackson administration ignored the mob, giving them their tacit support. Where have we heard that before? That was William Leggett's conversion to abolitionism. He just realized how awful this was and how these people were right, and they certainly shouldn't have their rights violated. And as part of that ongoing direct mails campaign, people were constantly trying to make their use of the post more and more efficient. And at the time, American postal rates were pretty high. It was very expensive to send stuff through the mail just because the post cost so much. So there were two people, Barnabas Bates and Lysander Spooner, who at the same time were trying everything they could to lower postage rates. Bates was doing it seems, explicitly to get cheaper postage for these direct mails campaigns against slavery. I'm not entirely sure that was what Lysander Spooner was doing, but he was absolutely an abolitionist, and a violent one at that. He thought it was justified to be violent against the slave owners. Um, and So I have a strong suspicion that that's what he was doing too. But the whole deal with the American Letter Mail Company is that he set up a private post to compete with the government. Barnabas Bates's tactic was to lobby politicians to lower postage rates by legislation, which is ultimately what they did. Spooner's goal was to just outcompete the bastards and deliver mail a lot cheaper, steal their business, and force them to actually compete. And that's what he did too. He accomplished it, even though he got shut down. They put him under injunction and made him shut down and took him to court over it. So the American Letter Mail Company died in the courts. But in the meantime, he so outcompeted them and put the pressure on them that they did have to lower rates. And it was this sort of pressure from both ends of the standard political reformer and then the renegade entrepreneur who's just going to outcompete them. And eventually Spooner, he writes these amazing pamphlets against slavery in the 1840s, saying that it is it goes against natural law, and so it's unconstitutional. No matter what the text of the Constitution seems to indicate otherwise. He says that the Constitution cannot be contrary to the fundamental law, and because the fundamental law of nature is universal equality, nothing in the Constitution can be construed to support something that violates that more fundamental law. That's the basis of his argument, and that converts some pretty important anti-slavery thinkers, but it also sets up a divide in the anti-slavery community over politics and whether we should support this constitutional system or be more radical abolitionists who want to tear the whole thing down. Most people aren't going to get behind that, so what do we do? And then fast forward, he's one of John Brown's so-called Secret Six who help plan, fund, and implement his raid on Harper's Ferry. And around the time, Spooner's writing broadsides and publishing broadsides encouraging Northerners to form abolition posses to invade the South and liberate slaves and take over plantation by plantation and just rampage private armies through the South. So, I mean, an intensely radical guy.
You mentioned someone else there that is probably not known to very many people in any movement, and that's Benjamin Lay. And I think you want to talk about Benjamin Lay, don't you? He's an interesting fellow.
Oh, he's my favorite.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy. You should mention him just a bit. He's an astounding figure.
Yeah, he's incredible. I wish I had the book I could show it to the screen here, but Marcus Rediker, who was on my doctoral committee, wrote this relatively recent still biography of Benjamin Lay, who lived in the late 1600s and early 1700s, first in England, and then he sailed around the world as a sailor for a few years. He lived in Barbados, and he ended his life in Pennsylvania, where he spent the last 30, 40 years. But as the title says, Benjamin Lay was the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist. And if that doesn't sell you, again, I don't know what else to tell you, because it's just incredible. But another great quote is from historian Gary Nash, who called Benjamin Lay a living stick of dynamite. And I think that's something we should all aspire to, to be that kind of person. And he absolutely was. He was just incredible. He was a Quaker, and like the title suggests, he was a dwarf. He was a little person. I'm not sure what kind of I don't know what to call what his condition was, but some sort of dwarfism. And he kind of cobbled together thoughts and experience from a whole bunch of different sources in life and put them all together in a really radical way that essentially meant that he had a radical sense of personal responsibility that he followed through every chance he got. So whether it was things like his Quakerism told him to be nonviolent. And so not only should you treat sailors with dignity and respect, unlike the ship captains did on the cruise that he worked. But you also shouldn't treat animals with violence or harm. So he stopped eating animals and he became a vegetarian and basically a vegan. About 200 years or so before the term was even in use, he was essentially a vegan. He had a little bit of milk and honey, were the only non-vegan things. He thought, of course, slavery should be abolished because it does harm to people, direct, measurable harm against their will. So that's a no-brainer. And he took every chance he got to challenge people to follow through on these kinds of principles, especially when he lived in the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania in the time of William Penn. And here are all these Quakers. They called them weighty friends, like weight as in heavy, weighty friends, because they were the powerful, wealthy Quakers of the colony, and they had more influence on the church and the politics and everything else. And wouldn't you know it, they had so much money and power because they were involved in the slave trade, or they had small plantations of their own and orchards and things like that where they had slaves working there. And these are people who are supposed to be nonviolent, and they're participating in this horrible system. And Benjamin Lay took this amazing burst of creative, religious, and political, intellectual energy coming out of the English civil wars in the 1640s and 50s, where we have the origin of the Quakers and all sorts of other reform movements and religious minority movements, just like a sunburst coming all out of the same place at the same time, with tremendously radical ideas behind some of them, including the Quakers' nonviolence. And he takes their like pamphlets and their ideas about revelations and their new interpretations spurred on by the printing press and things like this. And he says essentially that he takes like this reading of Revelation saying that slavery is the beast in Revelations, and it's up to good Quakers and good Christians and good people everywhere to wage war against Satan in the form of slavery, and that abolishing slavery would finally bring on the millennium and the reign of Christ and things like that. And you're like, he's just a fun, incredible, great character. And the best stories about him have to do with his like street theater shaming the Quakers for their supporting slavery. And the cool thing about it was that he would always put his body in the way. So like he would go basically naked and stuff himself in a snowdrift next to the church door. And when people would pass by, they would like be shocked. Like, you're going to get sick and kill yourself. What are you doing? Come on out of there, Benjamin. And he would say, oh my God, look at you. Look at you, who you say you care so much about me. You don't give a damn about your slaves who are shivering at home in a barn, with less clothes on than I have. And you act like you care about me. Give me a break. You're a hypocrite. Like, he would just, rant at people about this. And he was amazing. I think we need way more people with that kind of courage and bravery.
Well, are there any Benjamin Lays today? I can't think of anybody quite so astounding.
No, I don't think so. I think a lot of people would like to point to a Jordan Peterson type character, or like everybody has a martyr complex. Everybody who gets kicked off Twitter thinks that like they're being persecuted and need to be, let me start a GoFundMe to help out or whatever. And it's just it sometimes I think like, God, give me a break. It's ridiculous. I think way too many of us today like to whine rather than like actually put ourselves at risk. And I'm not somebody who's going out trying to be at risk either,
No, you made that clear earlier.
I'm not saying I'm up to Benjamin Lay caliber here. Like the whole point is he's exciting because he went out and made opportunities to just stick it in the face of people he thought were genuinely evil. And he did it in such a classy, Quakerly, way that like, you might think ranting and yelling at people isn't very classy, but in the light of time, he's yelling at a bunch of slave owners and slave traders, and you got to admire that.
But he was also a Christian. And to have the Christian background really does... I mean, people have to... who are Christians have to reinterpret everything he says in a context that makes sense to them from the gospel stories, for instance, or the Hebrew prophets. And nowadays, even Christians don't seem as imaginatively on board with the biblical texts that would be useful for that kind of activity. I think that there's been a major change in American culture, and we're much less Christian than we used to be. And part of that has been is that we have less purchase to be an effective challenge in a moral sense against somebody else's behavior or one's own, because it's just we don't share the vocabulary. Because the people who do the most kind of moral challenging don't do it in a Christian background now, and they often seem repellent to those who are of a Christian background. And now we have this weird divide of the Christians versus the anti-Christians, which is out there in a big, huge way. And as one who's not a Christian or an anti-Christian, really, I find this to be somewhat disturbing as well as interesting.
Yeah, I'm firmly in the godless heathen atheist crowd, and as you know, an out and proud left libertarian, probably a lot louder than some folks would like to on that one. But I always found it interesting talking about early America with students, and talking about Anne Hutchinson and antinomianism and stuff like that in early Rhode Island colony, and her trial in Massachusetts Bay and stuff like that. I would have them read the transcript and ask them, what's going on here? What are they talking about? And it's all this stuff. I don't know if you ever read that transcript.
Oh, I've never the transcript.
I'm sure you know the basics.
Well, I read the
You probably know the
Rothbard
basics
account.
of the story.
The Rothbard account in Conceived in Liberty is useful.
Yeah, I usually have them read that too, along with the transcript, whenever I've had the opportunity. And it's all this back and forth between Anne Hutchinson and the governor, where she's trying to say the governor is preaching a gospel of works, and she says that there's a problem with that, and what she's doing in her Bible study sessions is preaching a true gospel of faith. And the governor is like, how dare you? We don't preach a gospel of works. And I'm like, what are they talking about here? And they don't know students have no idea.
Right.
So they don't even know that this is the difference between Catholics and Protestants. Catholics believe in a gospel of works. You have to do good works while you're here on earth. And, that's why you go do confession, and you have to say your Hail Marys and whatever. And you have to follow the rules and the rituals of the church to accomplish the certain things that God tells you to do. That's Catholicism. And then the doctrine of faith is you don't have to do any of that crap. All you got to do is have faith. And that's it. And of course, there are a bunch of divisions between that, and that's what early American religious history is, kids. And they have no idea. And you can ask, how many of you identify as Christians? And, don't answer if you don't want to. And it's still always 80% of their hands. And they have not the faintest idea of any of this doctrinal stuff. And, so I firmly believe number of atheists has been going up anyways, but that's way underpolled, I bet. And if you actually take into account, do people even know what they say they believe in? Or do they have any conception of what it means to identify in the way that they say they identify? We're barely a religious society. I think that's good. I think that's an improvement. But that's not any kind of objective claim on my part, and it certainly can come with growing pains and problems and transition, which I think is what you're getting at. It's caused no small problem to the libertarian community either, that's for sure.
Are you a fan in any way of Herbert Spencer, or does he interest you in
Oh,
any
yeah.
Because his introduction to the Principles of Ethics makes pretty clear that he was trying to offer a secular alternative to the religious morality, which he thought was important and had served vital functions for society. But we just couldn't get along with that anymore. Was this argument, and we were changing, and he just wanted to help it along. It's still an open question to what extent people can accept a non-religious morality, because they certainly put religious elements back into their secular moralities. That's what I feel is going on with progressivism today, is that the love of and worship for and allegiance to the state is so strong with them that it feels like a religion. But the nice thing about people who believe in God is that God doesn't normally talk back. And it's very difficult to convince other people that God has directly spoken to you. So people are actually a little bit skeptical, and they have a sort of a nice distance between what they should and should not do regarding God and the supernatural. But the state's here. We have a very palpable state, and that leads people to some pretty dark alleys pretty quickly. And it's quite frightening when people want to have an unlimited and ultra-powerful state. That's a great line from John Hospers. He referred to it as the cult of the omnipotent state, the modern ideas. And it is a cult, and that I see as my chief enemy, is the cult of the omnipotent state. And it creeps up everywhere, because even conservatives are, in a sense, progressives. If you want to look at it in a certain way. And that religious instinct in man, when you divorce it from a conception of traditional religion, recently it's been taking an ugly turn in statism. And I find that to be disturbing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, well, hell, wasn't this part of what Nietzsche said we were all in for anyways, right?
Yeah. He prophesied the other. He was a somewhat more negative cast on the problem than Spencer had.
Yeah. But no, I think that's true, and it is very demanding of intellectual leadership. It takes bold new thinking and reviving the best ideas of the past to reconsider them too. And I most LocoFocos were Christians of some description too, and they usually cast their, not all of them, but they usually cast their ideas in terms of Christian democracy, which is, especially Fitzwilliam Birdsall says that a lot. It was a really important idea to him. The idea being, that democracy, in the way that LocoFocos wanted it practiced, delivered the promises of Christianity completely, according to the words of Christ from the Bible. It would give you that kind of godly society. And obviously that was faith misplaced in the mechanics of a democratic polity. It backfired like right away on them, time after time after time. But the core of their idea, I think, is totally worth reviving, because it never actually was implemented, which is just simply abolition. It started in William Leggett's War on Monopoly, and then he just extended that to the War on Slavery too. And whenever they won victories, it was always a half victory of some sort. It was led to some kind of compromise that ended up making everybody forget that they had anything to do with it in the first place. And the result is this weird corporate system that we have today, where it's sort of half fascist, half free market, part socialist mixed in, and nobody really knows what it is. Well, clearly they didn't want that. They wanted to abolish all of these artificial rights, powers, and privileges, all of them. And I think that's the kind of thing we still need to do. And you'll find this. I think there are good paths for like real political and cultural compromise right now in that abolition idea. You can get on board with abolishing the military and abolishing the prison system and the police. Libertarians and the far left should be able to come together on all three of those things and a lot more. Abolishing corporate powers and privileges of all sorts. And I'm sure there's a hell of a lot more we could do, but abolish. Don't just change these powers around. Don't switch them from one hand to another. Don't fund them in different ways. Don't put checks and balances and the office of this or that oversight or whatever. Just gut it and get it out of here completely. But for a lot of people, I think they justifiably feel like that kind of change would leave them out in the cold, and they need lots of protections from that overarching central government. So it's a big long-term battle that takes constant, moral activism of the sort like a Benjamin Lay, and constant intellectual leadership of a sort like William Leggett's.
And maybe some entrepreneurial activity like the engaged in by Lysander Spooner for a brief period of time in his interesting career.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, at that point, I think we have gone through an arc of ideas, and we've been back in time, forward to the present time. We've dealt with all sorts of issues, and I think we can conclude a podcast. What do you think?
Absolutely. Thank you a ton. It's been great.
Well, thank you to Dr. LocoFoco for taking time to talk with me about the things that I'm interested in. I'm hoping that a few people out there in the podcast land and elsewhere, maybe on one of the video platforms that this goes on, like YouTube, find it interesting as well. There's a lot of history out there that most people never talk about, and LocoFocoism is certainly one of them. And LocoFocoism is libertarianism. It's classical liberalism in its most radical form, in its first radical form in American history, that really took basic ideas that were around at the founding of the United States, of course, but took them seriously and advanced them in important ways. Now, I have to apologize to my audience. My sound was just dreadful for this recording. It took me a little while to improve it, but it didn't improve much in the treatment. And I have another episode where I have the same problem. It's in the can, and I've got to work on it. But I've recorded a third episode that does not have these problems. So there we are. In the future, my audio is not going to be so dreadful. And I noticed I didn't mention my name up front. My name is Timothy Virkkala, Timothy Workman Virkkala, the Workman with an I, not an O, and it's at Workman that you'll find me on social media, and workman.com is where I blog. That's Workman with an I, not an O. Thanks again to Dr. Anthony Comegna, Dr. LocoFoco, for filling us in more on LocoFocoism, past, present, and maybe even future. Keep thinking good thoughts, explore new ideas and old ones, try to make sense of the world, and strike a match for freedom.